So lately, I've been really getting into Formula 1 and enjoying it. Well, not lately, my interest peaked over the last year and a bit, but this season, I've been really enjoying watching an Australian man in a papaya rocket bullying everyone. And one night, on my autoplay, the great Google overlord decided to use its spyware to play me a video that I didn't know I needed to see. This one. And as I was laying there giggling half asleep, forgetting how a video on a Greek cargo ship that totally wasn't destroyed in a tax fraud led me to this, I heard the lines,
"Put it in simpler words, Red Bull is in a master-slave relationship with Max."
Yes, I'm aware this is dragging, but don't worry, I have a point. This entire situation of the Mr. Dutchman beating the ever-loving crap out of his broken home, aka Red Bull, until it cooperates and gives him some semblance of what he needs, is a great analogy for the one time the Russian Navy produced probably the most competent ship it has ever made, Aurora. I was not kidding when I said years ago that I would come back to the Aurora. I genuinely love this boat, and it is actually what got me into studying specifically the Russian naval history and all the many calamities that I've showed you along the way many moons ago, when my 11-year-old self unlocked it in the 2D game Navy Field. Yeah, that's a flashback and a half for people who know what it is. Anyway, the Aurora is to this day, in my humble opinion, the best looking thing to ever come out of that insane empire. And I mean, just look at it. Look at it! How can you not love it? Genuinely, the only thing I'm sad about not being able to visit Russia ever again for, all the airmail I've helped deliver, is the fact that I won't ever be able to see this thing in person. That's literally the only thing that makes me sad about not visiting that country. That and getting a chance in their archives, but let's be real, that was never happening. See, the Aurora bucks the trend, given that on the Voyage of the Damned and throughout its career, yes, the Kamchatka Voyage of the Damned, she was completely sane. As in, totally sane. As in, she was turned into a pincushion by different ships in the fleet because reasons, and because I feel like they were just upset that she was sane. And her crew, minus a little adventure that we'll get to in Madagascar, were also totally sane. They were competent, they had decent gunners, they were in general quite organised. I wonder if it has anything to do with this. Wouldn't be that, would it? The Aurora began life on the 23rd of May 1897 as one of 3 sisters of the Pallada-class cruisers, with her 2 sisters being named Diana and Pallada. See, now what you might be expecting here is yet another tale of an insane supership being forced to downsize over and over again. But no, weirdly enough, there was no grand plan for these ships. See, they were built at a time when sanity began to prevail in the Russian Navy. And I think that can be said to have occurred because of all the insanity that was being busy pumped into the Circle mega yacht thing and the subsequent corruption charges for its designer. See my video on the Lavardia. Under the new Tsar Nicholas II, the early years of his reign were marked by, get this, an actual effort to fix the Navy. And this was done by reaching out to other nations who are far more experienced at building cruisers. This time, they chose the Royal Navy to reach out to, who Russian admirals spoke to at length about using the basis of the Apollo and Astrea classes to build something new, and it was sorely needed. See, at the time, the Russian Empire was looking to expand into what was being dubbed as Yellow Russia, aka Manchuria, and Northern China. This was being undertaken with the overall goal of forcefully relocating the Cossacks to the east and forcing the Chinese into orthodoxy. It would also crucially give them that warm water port that they have been obsessing over since, well, forever. Yes, the name Yellow Russia has all of the connotations that you think it does. They chose yellow for a very specific reason, but I digress. But, to support this absolutely mental plan, which relied on the other powers of the world and region doing absolutely nothing, Russia would need ships able to operate far from home, in the east, to interrupt commerce, and undertake long-range patrol cruises, and so with that in mind the Palladas were designed. Aurora herself as constructed was 6,731 tons, 126.8 metres long, 16.76 metres wide, and could sail at about 19.2 knots. 0.8 of a knot slower than her design speed, but she could range out for 6,400 kilometres at 10 knots. If you want that in freedom units, 7 washing machines and 53 ballparks, I don't know, figure it out. On this hull, she sported 8 6-inch guns as her main primaries, and 24 3-inch guns in single mounts. Yes, I'm aware that I used Imperial for the gun size. That's normal. Don't question it. To operate this ship, she sported a large crew of 578 men. All in all, Aurora wasn't special. But she wasn't bad. She was a solid ship, a solid design, and would be fantastic at the role of long-range commerce raiding voyages alone, away from the fleet. So anyway, the Russian Navy forced her into a mainline battle fleet and sent her to fight the Japanese in 1905. The Aurora was completed on the 10th of October 1903 and departed Kronstadt as part of a squadron under Vice Admiral Verenius to reinforce Port Arthur, but for reasons quite literally unknown, all ships save for 7 destroyers were recalled when they reached the Red Sea. This severely annoyed the highly competent Admiral Makarov in Port Arthur, but it isn't like he could do much because, well, he was beheaded on his flagship after it hit a mine not long after the war with Japan started. This kind of worked out well for the Aurora though, because there were a few teething issues with the new ship, which is pretty common for new ships, and it allowed for a small refit upon returning to port. That's the uncommon part, the fact it actually got refitted. Also, Aurora avoided the fate of her sister Pallada, which was sunk in 1904 in Port Arthur and later taken into Japanese service as Tsugaru. Aurora would later then be attached to Admiral Enquist's squadron, along with Oleg and Zemchuk, Zemchuk actually being the one sank by SMS Emden later in the First World War, and attached to the 2nd Pacific Squadron under Admiral Roshesvensky. And now, the pain for Aurora would truly begin. As the fleet sailed out of the Baltic after a litany of incidents, the Aurora found itself steaming on the flank with Oleg and Zemchuk, when out of nowhere the scream went around the squadron that torpedo boats were quite literally everywhere. Now, in reality, we know these were in fact British fishing boats, but some absolute genius could not exactly tell the difference between a torpedo boat, a fishing trawler, and a several thousand-ton armed scout cruiser, and so the aforementioned uber mega geniuses shot at Aurora, hitting it 5 times and naturally angering the machine spirit. This impromptu shelling killed a sailor and none other than the ship's chaplain. I wonder if it was lost on anyone aboard that God had quite literally said, "Nah, f*** this, I am out," and abandoned the squadron to its comically stupid yet tragic fate. But was the pain over? Oh no. See, as we get to Madagascar, the crews were given some time to rest, and on Aurora, as with others, that meant going ashore, and when the crew came back, they brought aboard so many animals that the men were scared of going to sleep for fear of being eaten. They also brought back almost every kind of venereal disease on the planet, and to top it all off, a shockingly large quantity of opium, meaning that a fair chunk of the ship's crews, not just the Auroras, mind you, most of the fleet, were completely off their absolute tits for the next little bit. But weirdly enough, it seems that though through percussive maintenance that the men were whipped into shape by their captain and officers, and when the fleet exercised a little later into their stay, it was only the Aurora that showed a level of organisation and skill, putting on a regatta with her ship's boats, organising races, and for her services and being the only sane ship in the water, she was promptly shot at during a gunnery exercise because she was towing a target, and the gunners on the ship shooting the target decided to shoot the thing towing the target. This angered the machine spirit further. A few months later, the floating circus finally reached Tsushima, and hilariously, the squadron identified a Japanese ship as a Russian ship and signalled the nautical equivalent of, "Hi, we are here, how are you, how are the kids?" The Japanese couldn't believe their luck and then quickly mauled the Russian ships, to use an F1 term, as the video began, like a Red Bull mauls the career of anyone who sits in the second seat. And before long, all major Russian warships were on fire at best or sinking at worst. The Aurora itself had taken about 18 hits, and her captain had been killed. Admiral Enquist had a choice here. He could follow orders and charge into inevitable death, or leave. It is said that at the end of the first day, he assembled his officers and announced to them 2 things. 1, he was moving his flagship from the damaged Oleg to the less damaged Aurora, and 2, the 3 cruisers under his command were leaving and not taking part in a suicidal operation. And so the Aurora led the 2 other cruiser squadrons south to Manila into the American-controlled Philippines, where they remained in turn to the end of the Russo-Japanese War. Meanwhile, the Aurora's sister ship Diana, also with the fleet, made for and was interned in Saigon. The Aurora would escape the battle that sank so many of its fellow countrymen, and made its way back to European Russia in late 1905, where she went into well-deserved extended refit. The next few years were relatively quiet, and the First World War was, for Aurora, like most ships of the Baltic Fleet, also quite quiet. It is no secret that if the Russians came out to play in force, that the powerful German high seas fleet could put it to the bottom so fast it would make Tsushima look like a picnic. So for once, Aurora actually got to do the job it was designed to do, performing long-range patrols and occasionally assisting with shore bombardment. In 1915, the ship would receive a slight change to her gun power, with her new armament being 14 6-inch guns, and a lot of the removals of the smaller secondaries. And in late 1916, the ship was sent to St. Petersburg, now Petrograd, for repairs. But the thing is, late 1916 Petrograd is a very dangerous time to be a member of the Russian royal family, or really officer class in general, because as the crews sailed into their home port, they discovered that the rule of law had totally broken down, that the people were cold, that there was little food, and in general the city was on a knife's edge. Within a few short months, much of the crew felt sympathetic to the Bolsheviks, likely the machine spirit aboard did too. As tensions between the men and their officers, who were predominantly Tsarists, grew, more and more of the enlisted started to not worry about hiding their beliefs, and they wished for change. And things finally came to a head in February, March. The February Revolution is actually in March, because Russia used the Julian calendar, not the Gregorian, but that's a whole other thing. The officers aboard Aurora eventually snapped, and fired their pistols at the men in a foregone conclusion to attempt to restore order. In response, the crew armed themselves, seized their captain and demanded that he join the revolution, and stand with a red flag to show his support. When the captain refused, he was shot and killed alongside many of his officers in a purge. The crew then formed a revolutionary committee, elected a new captain, and raised the red banner. The Aurora was the first ship in the Russian fleet to officially join the revolution. Later that year in August, the men aboard would join in the defense of the Winter Palace, halting General Kornilov in his attempts to seize power. On the eve of the October Revolution, later that year, the ship and its crew would be assigned to dislodge the loyalist Tsarist cadets from the Nikolaevsky Bridge, and after completing this task, the Aurora responded to a signal from the Petropavlovsk fortress, firing a single blank shot from its forward gun to signal the assault on the seat of the provisional government, which would ultimately give the Bolsheviks power. And that's really where the legend of Aurora comes from in Russian/Soviet history. She started the October Revolution. After the Bolshevik seizure of power, the Aurora's crew was split up though, and used predominantly as land-based infantry, defending Petrograd against counter-revolutionary operations such as General Krasnov's attempts to unseat the Bolsheviks. The Aurora would remain moored on the Neva, and as the empire slipped deeper and deeper into civil war, the communist leadership liked the idea of keeping the ship as a powerful combat-capable warship, but the reality was that the Reds' enemies were not at sea. They were to the south and to the east, and really each other because they all hate each other as well. And so, Aurora was put into mothballs. That is, until 1922.
Then starting on made up with inspired us the tale of the deadly love.
The 1920s, as we have discussed so many times now, was a period of attempted rebirth for the Russian, now Soviet fleet, and any capable hull able to be used was being used. Thankfully, the Aurora was in good enough condition that she wasn't subject to some kind of abomination-style rebuilding, like the battleships, and she was recommissioned in 1922 as a training ship to prepare the crews for new ships being brought into service or refitted. Until 1933, the Aurora would live out her twilight years sailing around the Baltic with trainees showing the flag to Germany and other Baltic states. It should be noted that during this period only Aurora and Comintern, another cruiser, were really able to do this, with all the other major ships in the Baltic in refit or completely unseaworthy. In 1935, the ship completely broke down though, not having received a full refit for decades, and given the fact that the Soviets were trying to build so many ships, they didn't really care enough to try and fix it. She would be reclassified as a training barge unable to move, and it would be here that war again found Aurora. Unlike more other modern ships in St. Petersburg, Aurora would not act as a floating battery, being stripped of her guns and crew who were sent to the front to defend the city. The ship was only left with a single small 76mm anti-air gun to fight off air attacks, and this would prove not enough. Aurora would be sunk at her moorings in shallow water. By 1944, the ship was safe and out of range, and given her history, Stalin and the Central Committee gave the order to turn the ship into a museum to honour the glorious memory of the revolution. Keep in mind the event's propaganda value in Aurora in legitimising Stalin as the successor of the revolution, aka the revolution Aurora had started, aka Lenin's true successor. In 1957, the ship was finally repaired and opened as a museum ship in Leningrad, and she would stay there until 1984, where for 3 years she was put in a shipyard to be repaired to save us from sinking. The decision was made here to replace the entire hull below the waterline with a new welded hull, begging the old ship of Theseus, is this actually the Aurora or not question. See, that's a thing that comes up a lot with museum ships when they largely have to be rebuilt. Things like the Aurora, they do have to be rebuilt, or things like the Niagara or the HMS Victory. Eventually, things are going to need to be replaced, things are going to need to be removed, wood does degrade, as does metal. So if you do replace more and more of a ship, is it still the same ship? Is it still the same museum? Is it something new? Hence the ship of Theseus question. The argument is relatively commonly made for the USS Constitution, however, the US government does rely on a grove of the same kind of trees that originally built the Constitution, so you can kind of see how they fix that. Similar to Victory, which uses wood coming from Scandinavia, as the Royal Navy used to. So there is an in-depth argument to be made here about whether or not it is an authentic museum or not. I argue that it is because ships get maintained all the time. It doesn't make it not the same ship, it just gets maintained. During the refit of Aurora, though, they did discover that significant parts of the ship's hull was actually made in Britain, including significant parts of the armour. Now, you think that would be it, right? It's just a museum ship now. The Soviet Union is gone, but nope, the ship still has value in propaganda. And because of that, the current Russian government decided in 2013 to recommission the ship into the Russian Navy as its flagship, similar to how the Canadians use HMCS Haida or the British use HMS Victory. They are technically commissioned warships and the spiritual flagships of those respective navies. But that leaves us with one big problem. It's now the Russian Navy who is responsible for the upkeep and the maintenance of Aurora. And I can make it worse, because it's not just the modern Russian Navy who's responsible, it is specifically a project under the control of Yes, that Shoigu. Shoigu is now responsible for the maintenance of a very old, very fragile museum ship that is now over 100 years old. I'm personally convinced half the money that goes to, or was meant to go to Aurora, is going to his bank account. So, God help the Aurora. If the Mosphere is anything to go by, she's doomed. But, in saying that, the machine spirit inside it has probably seen worse. It was with the 2nd Pacific Squadron after all, so you win some, you lose more. You lose a lot more. But anyway, thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed. Like, comment, subscribe. I keep getting told I need to advertise my Patreon more. I do have one. I also have an Amazon thing because I know people don't like using Patreon after the Apple changes, so yeah, it is a thing. I don't really do it often, which is not good of me. I should do it more, but it's links, description thing. Click button, description. Yeah, that'll help. Bye.